Hello, 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 everyone. I'm your host, Joe Kiernan. Thank you for joining us tonight on Researchers on a Mission Radio here on Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. Tonight we will be joined by History Professor Mike Ruggeri. He will be speaking on early American civilizations and quite a number of other things. Before we get to all of that, I just want to quickly mention to everyone, please find your way to the website if you can. I encourage you to do so, to take part in the wonderful chat room that involves there, freedomslips.com. You'll find a lot of interesting people in there, a lot of professional people, a lot of wonderful minds, interesting conversations, and a lot of wonderful input to the shows. You have the opportunity to ask questions and give input real time. You can live interaction with the show. We bring fantastic guests here at the station. We bring highly credible people, bringing real researching firsthand, live from the researcher himself. If you could also find a way to click on the donation button. This is the world's largest listener-supported station. Throw $1 or $2 in. It goes a long way. It helps provide the platform in which all these shows are provided online. If you could also find the way to the seed pack, the survival seed pack, that's something I highly recommend. For the donation required there, you get a wonderful seed pack of almost 35,000 non-GMO seeds and pretty much everything that you would need to survive if need be, from cultivation and irrigation and water filtration. I know there's a Boy Scout manual in there too, so you really can't go wrong. You're pretty much set. With duct tape and that, you're good to go. Without further ado, I'm going to be bringing Professor Mike Ruggeri on. He's a retired history professor from the City Colleges of Chicago. He's taught history of the Americas, Latin America, Mexican history, basically Mesoamerican history across the board. And he's been doing a lot of fantastic work since then. He continues to. He's very knowledgeable on the topic of the Clovis civilizations, and more specifically, if I'm not mistaken, and I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth, but I believe has a great focus or a passion for pre-Clovis civilizations, or just pre-Clovis in general in the Americas, their orientations on how they came about to be here, what their purposes might have been. And it really goes a long way. I don't have to tell everyone. We know here in the Americas, Columbus came first, and there were a few people here. When Columbus got here, there were a few tribes scattered around. They all had fairly similar but different origin stories. And we all just assumed just a few thousand years ago, when the glaciers retreated, that a few people wandered over here, and they just nomadically ended up being civilized. Without further ado, I'd like to bring the professor on. I'm glad he could be here tonight. It really is a pleasure. I've been reading up on his work and on the topic in general, and it's an absolute pleasure to be able to present him tonight. And we get to hear right from the horse's mouth on the breakthroughs and the discoveries happening today. Professor, are you here with us?
Yes, I am. Hi, Joe, and hello to your audience.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And on a different note, thank you much for your work that you continue to do. Education alone, I'm grateful for you to provide that. It's a very difficult thing to be able to put one's passion onto others, and it seems that you have that passion. It's continued since retirement.
Absolutely, and the work on who the first Americans were, where they came from, when they arrived, how they got here, what their ethnicity was, very exciting and romantic topic in the field of archaeology today, because even though it's the Americas and even though we should be well informed, we didn't really start looking at this until very recently, historically, in terms of the annals of archaeology. So it shouldn't be brand new, but it is.
Now, I hear that as well, that it's almost a taboo thing for a lot of people they have a lot of credibility to put on the line digging back pre-Clovis. I believe as you and we had spoken earlier, that it really comes down to the evidence. You really have to present those facts. And it's tough to do when we're going back that far.
And it took almost 100 years of research to break the Clovis first barrier, to finally admit that there were people who came here before the Clovis folks arrived in America.
Now, can you for all the listeners out there, can you quickly just give us an input on who the Clovis were and approximately what time period that they were here in the Americas?
Okay, the Clovis culture is a culture that was named for a particular kind of blade that was found many decades ago in a place called Clovis, New Mexico. And it's a very unique blade. It's highly crafted. It's very original. It's a piece of art rather than a hunting implement. And it was found, after the first blade was found, they began to find these Clovis blades from east to west, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and all the way from Canada, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, Chile. Clovis blades all over the place, all the same, all crafted with the same elements within it artistically, and done so well by these people who came over to the Americas between 9,500 and 11,500 years ago, that even a flint knapper today, not using modern instruments, it's almost impossible for that person today to make a perfect Clovis blade, because the people, this Clovis culture, they started learning to make these blades probably when they were 5 or 6 years old. It was like a guild, and they were doing it their whole lives, and there's no flint knapper alive that's been doing this kind of work, in modern times since they were little kids. So they can't, it's very hard for them to copy and pass these off, forgery. That's how well they were done. So they came over during the last ice age from Siberia and going north to south, walking through the Americas 11,000 to 9,500 years ago, this Clovis culture. And then about 9,500 years ago, some event happened. Now they're positing, and have been for a few years now, that there was some kind of a comet or meteorite hit that completely wiped out the culture. Ecological changes occurred, and they very quickly disappeared. They had a short lifespan, and they disappeared to be replaced by what we call the archaic peoples across the Americas, who made blades that were very sophisticated and nice, but not anything like the Clovis blade. If you were able to find a genuine Clovis blade and tried to sell it on the open market, they're worth about $35,000 a piece now. That's how valuable and intricate these blades are.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow. Now, I know that they really are really finely crafted. They're designed incredibly well. If we were to design in Arrowhead with their purpose, because they also had it fluted out on the back, so it would go on and off of a stick or a spear projectile rather well, wouldn't it?
That's right. A lot of archaeologists believe that many of them are very large and probably unwieldy for hunting weapons, and many archaeologists believe that the Clovis blade was mostly a work of art that was traded and kept as heirlooms and so on, not used basically for hunting. Some were used for hunting, but many of them look more like artistic objects than hunting objects.
Yeah, they really are. It's tough because when we look at arrowheads, I understand how it's so easy to correspond them with certain civilizations, because they really all did craft different kinds of arrowheads. And you could pretty much see an evolution in just the arrowheads alone. And it says a lot for the people. It's almost, when we're looking at the arrowheads, as if for a great number of years we were doing so well, and then we started making points that really weren't so good at all.
That's right.
And then there was sort of an improvement, but in my personal opinion, I'm not speaking professionally, that it really seemed like the arrowheads really started coming into a nice pure fashion again when we started fixing them to arrows.
Right, and that would have been around the Mississippian period, around 100 A.D. or so, much later in the historical record.
Now, from the Archaic period, from roughly 3 to 6,000 B.C. here in the Americas, what was that time period like for these people? Were they highly nomadic as well, or do you think that they had cities per se?
Mostly nomadic north of the Rio Grande, and they would have had sites that were ceremonial in nature, plus in terms of hunting grounds, ecological in nature, that they returned to over and over again to the same place, but they were seasonal, and then they would leave and become nomadic and go over wider areas and come back to that spot maybe once a year, maybe twice a year, sometimes only every few years. So they didn't have permanent settlements, north of the Rio Grande at that time. You didn't have any real permanent settlement that you could nail down as a complex that would last for long periods of time until you got to the Adena and Hopewell civilizations in the Midwest and stretching over to the East Coast, and that would have been about 800, 900 AD.
I know the Clovis, they're directly associated with the Clovis point. I understand that. It's a great signature of theirs. It's a wonderful design. It seems that they knew the proper rocks to use for this purpose. They were able to create a really sharp edge, and it seems like they really fashioned different points for different purposes, and they seem to have done it very well. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Professor, the Clovis people that were associating with these arrowheads, with the points, not arrowheads, we lost those people. They seem to have vanished at a particular point, and that goes along with the points that they were crafted, and then the next upbringing or new flourishment of humans in the Americas, they had a whole other point, and it was almost like they were starting again in a little way. They really didn't have it down how to make it the right way. Do you think the people that were here in the Archaic period were descendants in a way of the Clovis, or do you think this was a new migration?
That we're trying to put together. The Clovis people, obviously, if they got from east to west and all the way down, from north to south, all the way down to the southern tip of South America, had to have had a much larger population than we previously thought. But along the way, they may have mixed with other people that came earlier, the pre-Clovis folks, and as a result, different cultural elements were added, different ideas were introduced, and so on. So you had, I think, a mixture of pre-Clovis and Clovis people at some point. But pre-Clovis people wouldn't have been as large population-wise, and they may have been wiped out by the larger Clovis population that came into the Americas about the time of the Ice Age. But they would have been there, and they had their own cultural roots and their own ideas and their own religious concepts that some of the Clovis folks and the folks in the Archaic Age may have learned from.
Professor, there was in the chat room, as we had spoken about, SJ in the chat room has a question for you. I would like to, if you could just describe a little bit in regards to the Clovis point, how it was particularly fashioned. How did they go about doing these? Was it just rock on rock?
They would use sand to polish it, rock to nap away at it and form it, and various kinds of rocks, scrapers and boulders and so on. And so you can see that if you're using Stone Age tools to make something like this, it's going to be a pretty rough array of tools that you have, and yet, despite that fact, they come up with some of the most beautiful blades, probably the most beautiful blades ever produced in the Americas. So these craftsmen, using these very primitive artifacts and tools, still had enough artistry using that kind of tool to make these blades. When you look at the Olmec civilization, the first culture in Mesoamerica, they crafted beautiful figurines and artifacts and tools and jewelry from an element a lot of times called jadeite. And jadeite is the second hardest element on the earth after diamonds. And so they chopped into the second hardest element stone on earth with very primitive stone tools and scrapers and sand to polish it and so on, and came up with the most sinuous, the most beautiful, the most lustrous kind of art that, in my opinion, Mesoamerica has ever seen. And they were the earliest. The art of Mesoamerica was always pretty good, but I think the Olmecs, the first ones, were the greatest at what they were doing. So it's often not a progression from the most primitive to the most modern. Sometimes the most primitive are the most modern in terms of their abilities, their craftsmanship, and their design.
The Olmecs did appear to be quite crafty when it came to the arts, or they really had a passion with it. They did it on a great scale with great detail, but it was much different than everything else that we were seeing, or we really have seen in the Americas since. It really did appear Orient in fashion, and not even just specifically speaking to the human statues. It really seems to fit the time over there, but it really seemed that they were here. They set up shop here. They were civilized, had a city going, were creating art and possibly civilization. I know they used jadeite, and I know jade has always been a popular item for jewelry and other fashions in the Orient. And how do you think the Olmecs came to be in that area? How is it, do you think, they made it that far down without really leaving a good trace along the way?
Well, that's on the northern Gulf Coast. And so if we assume that people were traveling from the Clovis population from the Ice Age on, from north to south very slowly, eventually the Olmecs would have been the descendants of these Clovis folks who came over 9,000, 11,500 years ago. And there's a precedent to pyramid building and city design in Louisiana, right across the coast in a place called Poverty Point, and another site that, as I'm getting older, I'm forgetting the names of sites, but there's two sites in Louisiana, Poverty Point being the most important one, where you have what looks like an urban complex with pyramids and so on, dating back to, and by what I say pyramids, large mounds that you could call pyramids. Pyramids come in different shapes and sizes. They can come to a point. They can be flat at the top. They can be rounded. The first pyramid the Olmecs built was just a round volcano-shaped clay mound at a site called Raventa that they sculpted to make it look like a volcano. So this site at Poverty Point goes back to 5,000 BC. So if you had people at Poverty Point making what looks like an urban complex, and it's very sophisticated layout, design, and so on, and making mounds that appear to be, for all practical purposes, pyramids, then you might see a connection then from Louisiana on the other side of the Gulf Coast, across the Gulf of Mexico, onto the northern Gulf Coast of Mexico. So I think there's a relationship between the ancient peoples of Louisiana and the other.
Hey, Professor, we have a caller that has called in here that wanted to get a question in here. Area code 604, are you there?
Yeah, this is SJ. Thanks,
SJ,
Joe.
how are you?
Oh, I'm fine. I wanted to talk to Dr. Ruggeri about specifics on the Clovis forming. specifically the center bladed, oh God, what is the name for it? The center portion.
The fluted?
The flute,
section?
yes, the flute, exactly. Did you ever get to see a flute formed yourself?
No, there's flint knappers who do this kind of demonstration where they can show this kind of work, but I've never sat there long enough or in a place where somebody is so good that I can see them make this. And
do you know if they did it first or second?
I think they would have had to have done it second, because I think you got to form the blade, and there's got to be some bulk to the blade. You got to have enough bulk to make that groove. Don't you think?
Well, it's easy. I've done flint knapping myself, and it's easy enough to get rid of the excess, but the center flute is the difficult one. Now, I've made the center flute a couple times by accident and tried to cut out the arrow around it. And I was wondering if I got it right or if they had a specific order that you were able to determine so far.
Yeah, I don't know that point, but I know if you do this, you must know how hard it is to make a rounded concave flute in a piece of stone.
Yep, I found that when you start to get to the final forming of the blade, that pressing the blade down on a deer horn stuck in a stump is the most accurate way of forming it.
Right.
All right.
They must have done things like that themselves using horns.
That's what I'm thinking.
All right. Thanks, SJ. I
You
appreciate
betcha.
it.
Love you both. Really interesting show. Your volume's a little uneven.
We're working on it.
You got it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Professor.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for taking that. We got a lot of good feedback coming in. We were speaking with the Olmecs, and we were speaking. You were speaking about the pyramids and the structures that they were building on their side of the Gulf, and it must have been going on the other side as well in Louisiana area. There is a known site, a Clovis site in the South Carolina area, the Topper site, and they're pulling out a lot of interesting things there, but not as much as that was up in the caves in Oregon. Can you tell us a little bit on the discoveries in Oregon that puts us indefinitely pre-Clovis?
Let me tell you about the first breakthrough, and then we'll move to Oregon, because they come to one another.
Very good. Very good.
The first confirmed pre-Clovis site is a site called Monte Verde down in the southern Pacific coast of Chile that was excavated by archaeologists by the name of Tom Dillahay. And what he found there were some fabrics, textiles, human footprints, which in archaeology sometimes are almost as good as finding bones if they're at the right layer, housing posts, some ancient wood, evidence of a settlement that go back to 14,800 years ago, which was before Clovis by, a good amount of time. And it took him and his team 20 years to convince the rest of the archaeological community that he had a pre-Clovis site, because the Clovis first people were so strong in the field of archaeology that they refused to budge. It was a dogma. You get dogmas in every field of science. Archaeology has these dogmas too, and the people who studied the first Americans in the beginning were Clovis first people. They staked their reputations on it. They staked their research papers on it. They staked their books on it. They staked their university postings on it. They weren't about to listen to anybody tell them that there was actually a people that came to the Americas, not by way of walking across a very dry and barren Bering Strait during the Ice Age, but by canoe, all the way from Asia, all the way down to the southern coast of South America on the Pacific coast. They weren't going to buy this. And so why did it take them 20 years? Because there was that academic resistance and dogmatic resistance. For one, people who were in this field did not want to give up their place as having discovered that the Clovis were the first people they thought. But beyond that, archaeology is a field where you have to go a long distance, sometimes with a very big team, with a lot of tools and a lot of permission, You have to have a very large research grant. You have to be able to have the time with your team to spend 6 months in the field to check things out. And so there might be teams that went down to Monteverde during those 20 years, maybe once every 6 months or so. So it goes in very slow motion to try to prove or disprove Tom Dillahay's science. But finally, about 1976 or so, maybe 1980, a very large team with different grants from different places in the United States and elsewhere came to Monteverde because they were beginning to be convinced that maybe there was something there. And they brought all their tools with them, and they finally admitted that Tom Dillahay was right, and he had found the first pre-Clovis site in the Americas. And that opened up a whole new branch of American history because it meant that the first Americans then could not have come here during the Ice Age across the Bering Strait because there was northern Arctic waters, very cold, very forbidding. The only way they could have gotten down here into the Americas before the Clovis era was by way of canoe, hugging the coast of Asia, going across to the Aleutian Islands, which would be the closest to Asia they could get, and then hopping from island to island along the Aleutian Islands, and then coming into the Americas along the Pacific coast slowly over a long period of time, so that when they finally reached Monteverde 14,800 years ago, these people would have been traveling by fission and fusion pattern down the coast of America perhaps as early as 40,000 years ago to have reached Monteverde by 14,800 years ago. Tom Dillahay, he had the footprints that were dated at 14,800. No one argued with that once they studied it, but he didn't have any actual human DNA. And a few years ago, he found some seaweed at the same level as the 14,800 footprints and artifacts that he already found. And the seaweed, luckily, had been chewed on by humans. And so they took the seaweed to the labs, and they found that, yes, this was seaweed chewed on not by animals, but by human beings 14,800 years ago. So he had sort of living proof that there were people living here and eating here at 14,800 years. So that was the big find, and that opened up everything. The next big, and there were finds in between, but the next big find was in a place called Paisley Cave in Oregon, where archaeologists, his name escapes me right now, it's going to come to me in a minute. Anyway, he found artifacts in a cave up there in Paisley, Oregon, that dated to about 13,500, 14,000 years ago. Hunting tools, artifacts that were not made by accident, by rock falls, by geological action, by animals chewing on it, but incontrovertible human tools that were dated and redated by people who came to check them out to see if they could disprove them. So he's got this cave, he's got the tools that have been incontrovertibly dated, but he still needed some DNA evidence. And luckily, a few years ago, he himself found some coprolites, human coprolites. Coprolites are what archaeologists polite terms for human feces that have been carbonized over time, so they turn as hard as rock. And the coprolites were found at the same level as those artifacts that we found that were pre-Clovis. Once the coprolites were taken to the lab, of course, they ground them in the powder to determine what was eaten by the humans that was found in those coprolites, and it turns out that what they ate were animals that existed at that site and had become extinct by Clovis time. So he found the second site in the Americas, pre-Clovis, with DNA evidence, with artifact evidence, with human habitation evidence that we have found so far. There's many other sites where there's a lot of arguments about whether they're pre-Clovis or not. There's a few sites that are tangential, that are between Paisley Cave and Monteverde, and just some guesswork. But that's where it all began, with Monteverde first, Tom Dillahay, and then now at Paisley Cave in Oregon.
So that's having the coprolite. That's distinctive proof. There's really no way we could argue that.
No.
And now we have that, and we also have a pre-Clovis body as well.
There's a body that's Clovis. You're talking about Kennewick Man?
Yeah, Kennewick Man.
Kennewick Man is Clovis. But
Okay.
He's got an interesting set of variables here. That was before the Kennewick Man became big news before Monteverde became big news, because it was so exotic and exciting to find. They found Kennewick Man in a kind of a bog along the Pacific coast in Washington State, and it was the first almost complete human skeleton we ever found of Clovis-era people. We have thousands of Clovis human bones, but they're mostly skulls and teeth, femurs scattered here and there. But we've never found a complete skeleton of a Clovis person until we found Kennewick Man. And what made it interesting is the archaeologist that dug up the Kennewick Man, the first thing he said, or one of the first things he said, it was reported, was that he had a Caucasoid-like skull. And that set everybody aflame, because when you hear Caucasoid, you think of Europeans. And so people who want to put Europe first, I would say, began to claim this proves that the Clovis people came across the Atlantic into the Americas, and here's the Kennewick Man with this Clovis skull. But that was a bit premature, and it was not, people who believed that were not cognizant of genetics of ancient peoples across the world, and what a Caucasoid skull might mean overall. So when they did further studies on him, they found that he was a mixture, an admixture of many different racial types, tribal types, you might say, mostly Asiatic in origin. The Caucasoid skull is also found in ancient Asia, Central Asia. Caucasoids evolved in Asia. And so that's where the Caucasoid skulls would have originated, and that's where this Caucasoid skull, the Kennewick Man, would have come from. So when they did his DNA, they've reported so far that the DNA shows an admixture of folks as far south as the South Pacific, Negrito types in the South Pacific, Polynesian types, Japanese types, Korean types, Central Asian types, Mongolian types, Siberian types. And what that tells us is that Kennewick Man is a product of many tens of thousands of years of human interaction, interbreeding, by peoples over in Asia and all the way down to the South Pacific, who traveled from south to north over 40,000 years and mixed with all these different kinds of people, these different racial types, these different tribes. So that by the time you have Kennewick Man, you have a multicultural, multiracial person. So it's really interesting, how this turned out, and Kennewick Man opened the door to our understanding of that element in terms of who the first Americans were. And the evidence at Paisley Cave shows mostly Northern Asian and Siberian influence. We don't have there's no bones there yet, so we don't have enough to do DNA evidence of this admixture that Kennewick Man has. But there are skulls that have been found in Brazil that are very similar to the kind of skull that you find with Kennewick Man. And Brazilian archaeologists are claiming that there's a relationship here between the kind of body type and skull type that you find with Kennewick Man and the body type and skull type you find with these folks in Brazil, that they say stretch back to pre-Clovis, although they haven't proven that these skulls are pre-Clovis. They're at least Clovis in terms of their timeline. And so what may have happened here, and what looks more and more probable, is that the first Americans started their journey north by way of canoe, by fission and fusion over tens of thousands of years, somewhere in Southeast Asia. And the first groups went south, island hopping from Southeast Asia. You can see on a map, you can island hop all the way to Australia. And so the Aborigines, the native group, the inhabitants of Australia, we know that they got to Australia between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago. And they have this Caucasoid-like skull that Kennewick Man has, and they have the same admixture of Korean, Japanese, South Pacific, Negrito types that Kennewick Man has. So you had groups starting to go south that reached Australia 40, 50,000 years ago, and you had other groups who went north, mixing with all these populations until they got to the Americas perhaps 40 to 50,000 years ago. So you see there's a relationship between the first Americans and the Australian Aborigines, and there's a relationship between the Australian Aborigines, the first Americans, and all of these racial groups that you find all across Asia, including the ones with the Caucasoid-type skulls.
Now, do we think that these people just naturally went out seeking for lands and kept going further and further out, or do you or is there any theories passed around on what could have sent people going out in search of land for maybe reasons of necessity?
Yeah, physical anthropologists, when they study the movement of ancient peoples, they talk about this fission and fusion pattern and how slowly folks by canoe or walking move. They're not quite that adventurous. What they do is they occupy one site, one spot of land for hundreds of years until they've hunted it out or until there's some kind of ecological crisis and there's no more food. And some of those folks have to leave. So they move on by way of canoe or boat further afield, further north or further south until they find a place where there's more plenty going on, and they settle that for a couple hundred years until the same thing happens. They hunt it out, it becomes ecologically barren, and some of those folks move on to another field, south and north. So this fission and fusion pattern is very slow in human history. They're not going, they're not running, they're not moving very quickly. They're doing it in terms of finding food, and they don't have to. If they find food 100 miles away, 200 miles away, they don't need to go 1,000 miles.
Right.
So that's how it works over time.
Right. It certainly would answer a lot of questions as to when I was growing up in school, and of course Columbus landed here. There were groups of people here, but we didn't get to learn any of this stuff. That's for sure.
We learned about ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, but nothing about the Americas.
No, nothing about the Americas. But in school we just heard there were a few civilizations that existed here in the Americas, and they disappeared. We don't know what happened to them, as if they vanished. But it surely would answer as to why so many civilizations, it appears they just left. And it's always been suggested that food was the reason, and it still is today.
And with the Clovis people, it may have been an interstellar reason, a comet or a meteor strike that changed the weather pattern. So,
well, is it possible we can touch on that? Earlier we were involved in a different part of the discussion, and there was mention in the chat room in regards to a meteor or a comet or something from heavenly, some sort of interaction that led to the demise of so many mammals here in the Americas. What is the common accepted belief as to what set forth this a lot of the larger species becoming extinct and the ice sheets? Because I believe the ice sheets started retreating and then they went into full force and then retreated again. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's probably what's acceptable.
So
the evidence for this comet or meteor strike was not well received for a long time, but more and more research, more and more evidence is turning up that there probably was some kind of a cosmic event that created at least some part of this ecological change that killed off the Clovis culture, the Clovis people.
Now, how long do you think it took to wipe out the Clovis?
It looks
do
pretty.
Do we see enough to actually see a decline?
It looks pretty rapid because their culture lasts. Their blade and what the peoples associated with the blade. You see that they're here, 11,500 to 9,500 years ago, and suddenly there's no evidence of this person, these people, this blade, this culture existing after that date. Now, it could be that, there's drought, there's famine, all kinds of things besides some kind of interstellar event could occur that could wipe out a good proportion of them. And there may have been some Clovis people still left, but they may have then run into other groups that weren't Clovis oriented and not as crafty and lost their skills along the way. I mean, you can see it probably was a gradual process, but the disappearance of the blade was pretty rapid.
Yeah, it really did seem to be the case, and it seemed like it was completely forgotten in a way. It was they really didn't have that artistic perfection design in the craftsmanship of them. I mean, they really did have very smooth edges, but they were also serrated as well. You know,
there's the one that came after that was most important, is something called the Folsom point, which
yeah,
is anywhere near as beautiful as the Clovis blade. And I guess there would be Folsom point folks who would say, oh no, look, this is just as artistic as the Clovis. But if you see them side by side together, just, aesthetically, the Clovis blade is a lot more pleasing, I think.
Yeah, they're both pretty crafty designs, I can tell you that. Is there evidence that they were specifically looking? Were they hunters of large prey, or was that also a necessity of dying species that they were just hunting anything they could?
Certainly, there's Clovis blades stuck in large mammals that we found in many places, so they did go after large prey, but I think for the most part they're looking at rabbits, turtles, snakes,
Yeah.
much smaller animals. I remember hearing one archaeologist from Alaska talking about the fact that if they went out to kill some kind of an ancient elephant with one of these blades and they actually brought it down, that this would be probably some once-in-a-lifetime thing that they would come and tell their kids and grandkids about. It wasn't bringing down big game like that probably wasn't a real frequent occurrence.
Right. The Olmecs, when we were talking about the Olmecs before, it's always important to bring up the topic of art, because for some strange reason we always hold such value in art and the perspective of the messages that we're trying to give out. And the Olmecs, they created the very large heads that appeared to be of Asian descent, right? That was the Olmecs who made these large heads?
Big, giant stone that no one else in the Americas ever made, even copies of that, once the Olmecs were gone. So that Olmec head was unique. I mean, they passed on a lot of art styles that Mesoamericans later on picked up, but no one ever made those heads again. So once they disappeared, the heads disappeared with them. It was an art style that was not copied. So that's an unusual factor in terms of an art style disappearing once the people disappear.
Yeah, it always seems to be the case. It always does. It seems that they always flourish when a civilization is flourishing. They have such beautiful art, and it tells so many different messages on how things were. But then it usually is just gone. It's like with the Clovis points or the Olmecs art. I mean, the heads that they were carving were symmetrically. Those things are pretty darn good. They've done a really good job, and those are pretty big stones.
Exactly. They had to go where the heads are located in the Olmec area. They had to travel to a range of mountains 150 miles away through swamps. It was a rainforest jungle. Through swamps, muddy land, riverines, creeks. Sometimes along the ocean they could take the canoes to get to the mountains to chop out big enough boulders to make these heads. And archaeologists feel that what happened there when they got to the mountains is that they chunked out the boulders from the mountain and then they carved the heads there, because it would have been lighter to carve the heads there and take the heads with them than take the gigantic boulders that they carved the heads from with them to their sites. So they carved the heads at the mountains, and then they had to take these heads that weighed many, many tons, and they didn't have wheels, and they didn't have horses, and they didn't have any pack animals, 200 miles back to their sites across mud, swamps, riverines, creeks, jungle, chopping their way through jungle. It was a prodigious feat. And people even today, when they're trying to see how it could have been done, have a very hard time understanding exactly how they did this. And the way the artistic depiction of it by some folks today show it is that they built giant rafts of logs, and maybe teams of 100, 200 guys, and they made ropes, and they dragged the heads onto the raft, and they dragged the raft through the riverines and lakes, and then perhaps they could float up to the coast, the ocean, and float the raft down the ocean, but then they would have to come inland to the site. When they got them to their sites, the Olmecs built their sites elevated because they couldn't be inundated by water and floods because it's a swamp. So they built their sites, their cities on artificially elevated ground. So they had to get those stone heads on those rafts up that elevation to the middle of their site. So this story I'm telling you is an amazing story because it's very hard for us to envision how they did this.
I know. There's a lot of questions. There's discussion right now about the different stones that were used to make a lot of these points. And I know chert was a popular one down here in the southeastern part of America that was for Clovis. What were the other choices? Because these Olmec stones, like the heads, that was a very, very tough stone to work too. And I would imagine the purpose was to make sure that it lasted for a while, because as you just mentioned, they really went through quite an effort to get it there, and it had to have been of great importance to them. It just doesn't sound like something that they were doing just as a bet to one another. It sounded like something quite important. And they did seem to have particular interests in certain stones. Where, as I was mentioning, chert was here. Chert was being used down here. I know it's an accessible stone here in the southeast, and there's really not too many stones to choose from. But they seem to have known what stones to use, or at least have been around long enough to know which ones not to use.
Other than the stones, most of their artwork is from lustrous iron ore materials and from jadeite, like greenstone and serpentine, mineral elements that shine. And especially when you shine them up, they were attracted to that because it's just more artistically pleasing. The heads, of course, are just granite, and so you can't shine that up, but they were impressive in terms of their size and in terms of the design. They also built giant stone altars that were as heavy as the stone heads that you don't see as many pictures of.
Right.
They had as many of those altars as so far they've dug up 22 of these giant Olmec heads. They're going to find more, but we found 22 so far. And there's probably at least that many giant stone altars as well, made from granite. And their small artwork is the greatest work because it's so lustrous, it's so well designed, it's so serpentine in style, flowing in style, so redolent of what looks to me as somebody that's always looking at Mesoamerican art and looking at Asian art, that it's an art that's related in some very distant way to Oriental design. And I have to be very careful when I say that because I'm not saying that there was contact between China and the Olmecs at the time the Olmecs made this work of this art, but they must have brought with them, on their way from Asia into the Americas over these tens of thousands of years, certain kinds of artistic expressions, certain kinds of religious ideas that the shamans that led them on their journeys into the Americas kept in their ancestral memory. They had a religion when they came to the Americas, and that religion has very deep roots. And that religion shows up in every piece of Mesoamerican art ever. The Mesoamericans, all the people in ancient America, they did not make art just as a decorative artifact. They made it, all of it, for a very deep religious purpose. So every piece of art they make, there's some religious ideas attached to it, and a lot of it you can see reflected in early Asiatic civilizations.
Professor, I hate to cut you off right there. Everyone, if you just stay tuned, we'll be back in a few minutes, just after a few messages here. Be back with Professor Ruggeri in just a few moments. Stay tuned. Hello, welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, Joe Kiernan. We have a special guest joining us tonight. We have History Professor Mike Ruggeri. He's been speaking on many things, Mesoamerica. We touched on the Archaic period, Clovis, pre-Clovis, all the arts involved, structures, Olmec heads, points. Their points are still incredible and definitely art within themselves. Professor, are you still there with us?
Yes, I am.
We're happy to have you here. And I wanted to mention, as I should have before, I do appreciate you joining us. I know you did have terrible weather coming through there today. And, there was, before the break, when we were talking, there was a little bit of little chat going on in the chat room, of course, and it was in regards to Easter Island off of South America. And it was because we were speaking the Olmec heads, and how they're similar. They're large heads made of stone. Again, another group of people that just vanished off of that little area. Again, have you found, or do you think there could be any correlation between the two?
There's been a lot more advanced research on the genetics of the folks who live in Easter Island, the descendants of those people that built those structures, those spaces. And as it turns out, they're all Polynesian. All of their genetics are Polynesian in origin. So it was a Polynesian group that the Polynesians were great, ocean goers, and with no instruments whatsoever, they could find their way across the Pacific thousands of miles from island to island until they finally reached Easter Island. There was some thought that perhaps ancient Peruvians had traveled to Easter Island in very ancient times, and that was the population that made those carvings on Easter Island. But as it turns out, there's no connection between Peru and the Polynesian population that lives in Easter Island today. It's purely South Pacific peoples that came to that site. There is a lot of research going on now, though, in terms of Polynesians coming to South America, and perhaps South Americans visiting some Polynesian islands, and that is another area where there's a dogma against it that's long-standing in the field of archaeology. But there are a few things now that are raising eyebrows and bringing up questions about whether or not there was an actual trade network that extended all the way from the South Pacific Polynesian islands into the Pacific coast of South America. And the three things that are striking in this is, first of all, the sweet potato. The sweet potato was found in Hawaii and in Polynesia, and it has its roots in South America. And the word for sweet potato in one Polynesian language is exactly the same word for sweet potato in that area of South America. So that's very suspicious in terms of context. How did that sweet potato get from South America into the Polynesian islands? Another interesting element is chickens. They found chickens. Chickens originated not in South America, of course, but they were brought by Europeans. But there was also a species of chicken in Asia, and so you have these chickens that they found in Chile that are dated, long enough ago to where you could have had ancient Polynesians bringing their chickens with them to South America, and so they're still arguing about those chickens and how they got there, but. There's some proof that this may have been, evidence that chickens were brought by Polynesians to South America and sweet potatoes were brought by South Americans to Polynesia. And you had some other things going on there in terms of language similarities and a few other facts. But it's becoming more and more clear that there had to be some contact here between Polynesia and South America, at least for a limited period of time, some kind of trade network developing. That's a new field. It's controversial, but the folks who are working in this field are finding out more and more evidence of this particular kind of contact.
Yeah, I understand why it's debated. However, if it's widely accepted that Polynesians had settled Easter Island originally, and I as well, I do know that they were great seafarers. They were excellent navigators. They had excellent vessels that weren't long, but weren't short, but they were very seaworthy vessels that they had, and it doesn't take much to think if they could find Easter Island with no problem. They have to know of the enormous landmass just beyond Easter Island.
And as it turns out, the winds that come off of the ocean there, as the Polynesians would have traveled across the Central Pacific,
Right.
would have led them to two places: Panama, apparently, and where you find these chickens and where the sweet potatoes come from in South America. So it may not be a coincidence that the winds lead the boats to those spots.
Right. It's very true. They do. The eastern winds still come pretty strong down there, down on the southern end of South America. I know they still go through there pretty good. But, do we find any genetics in early Peru or in Chile, anywhere along the coast? Do we find any Polynesian DNA?
The problem with genetic studies is in archaeology, for some reason, there's so few studies, and there's so many years between studies that are real, peer-reviewed studies, that, it's frustrating to get this kind of information. With the Kennewick Man, for instance, because it was so popular, and because you had a whole team that was working on it almost from day one, the time they found it, we come up with all this DNA evidence that shows a Polynesian connection with Kennewick Man. So it wouldn't be surprising to find a Polynesian connection somewhere in some ancient bones in the South American cultures. I'm sure that that's going to happen eventually.
Yeah, and especially since they were so seafaring, they were everywhere.
For instance, the Cahokia, the biggest city ever built in north of the Rio Grande in the Americas until modern times. It had a population of about 20, 30, 40,000 people, and they have lots of bones there, hundreds of full skeletons, hundreds of them. And yet, despite that fact, I was asking the chief researcher at Cahokia just a few months ago about this. They've never done a genetic study on a single bone at Cahokia, as far as I know, and as far as the chief researcher knows at that site. And so, you wonder why this isn't done more often and why people are more interested in this. But if they're not doing it at Cahokia, which is a site that has, that dates from 1200 AD, it's much closer in time to us, and they're not doing genetic studies there, you can see why it would be so difficult to find archaeologists doing genetic studies from bones in South America that would go back, say, 6,000 BC, 10,000 BC, 20,000 BC. They're just not doing it.
If we're talking, anything in Egypt going back to 6,000 BC, they're all in. We want to get every single thing we can on it. And here we're talking 6,000 BC is just the beginning. We're talking much earlier, much older. How can we not want to eat this up?
I know. And even with Kennewick Man, despite the fact that they did these original DNA studies, since that first study where we found this genetic admixture, it's been maybe 15, 20 years, and they've never done a follow-up. And they have the complete skeleton, under lock and key, by the way, because the Native American tribes did not want these bones to be investigated by these researchers. Native American tribes in North America have, real hard time letting the white folks look at the bones of what they feel are their ancestors. And so they have to keep the skeleton under lock and key because there have been attempts to steal the skeleton and bury it so that there could be no more studies. So they have it, and it's under lock and key, and yet they've never followed through with even more studies, as fascinating as these first studies of Kennewick Man were. So it's very surprising. It's mystifying almost in the field of archaeology why this work isn't done more extensively on all of these bones.
Now, I'm really glad you mentioned that because I don't just hear that with Kennewick Man. I've heard that quite a bit with other Clovis bones. Why is there a reason why these bones really aren't being studied?
There's a federal law, NAGPRA it's called, and it's an acronym that means I don't remember the meaning of each letter, but it's the Native American Repatriation Act, which says that if we find bones of folks that may be related to Indian tribes, Native American tribes in that region, they must immediately be turned over to that Native American tribe without study by the Native. They have to be reburied by the Native American tribe. And the Native American tribe may give permission to the researchers to investigate these bones, but almost always they don't. And so as a result, we're held back by that. It turns out we've got these ancient sites. I live in Chicago, Illinois. We've got these ancient sites, Mississippian sites, going back to, say, Mississippian Society 900 to 1200 AD, that where you've got these very interesting mounds that have never been excavated because we excavated some mounds and then they passed this act. And so now you can't even go into a mound to find burials or artifacts because the Native Americans have to approve it and say, okay, you can do this, and they always say no. So there's this ancient history right in front of us that we can't touch.
Well, that is going to make it pretty tough.
It's not so much the case in south of the Rio Grande, and I don't want to get into the politics of that because that becomes very controversial, but the Spanish, the more white Mexicans, they don't care what the Native Americans have to say about anything, so as a result, they've been able to study these remains more extensively than we have north of the Rio Grande. So that's the politics of that. There's a lot of politics in archaeology.
With Kennewick Man, he was quite an interesting person though, because if I'm not mistaken, he had a projectile of sorts that was it in his bone?
Yes, that's what killed him.
Oh, that it was that they agreed that's what killed it. That's what killed him.
That's what appears to be that projectile killed him, and he was about between 35 and 40 years old. He's 5'7" to 5'9" in height, which would have been, probably the average for a male in that time period. The projectile may have, it's not clear whether that was a direct death of Kennewick Man, but it certainly contributed to his death.
Professor, are you familiar with the South American sites, the early sites of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku?
And there's even earlier sites now in Caral and other sites in Peru that date back an amazing amount of years ago. The first pyramid ever built in the world was built in this area around Caral. We thought at first when we found Caral and we dated it, that it was dated about 2800, 2900 BC, which would make it 350, 400 years older than the first pyramid ever built in Egypt. And since that first pyramid that they excavated and dated at Caral in Peru, and they found that this was older than the first pyramid in Egypt, they have since found other pyramids nearby that are even older, going back to, say, 3,500 to 3,800 years before the first pyramid built in Egypt. And most people haven't even heard of these yet. It's only a few Peruvian archaeologists and some American archaeologists working with Peruvian teams that have uncovered these new pyramids. We just had a speaker at the Chicago Archaeological Society, which I'm an officer in, a couple of weeks ago that was just down at those sites excavating these pyramids, and he gave us this information on pyramids that they have found nearby Caral that are older than Karo, that date back, 3,500 to 3,800 years before the first pyramid was ever built in Egypt. Pretty extensive culture and civilization that early in ancient Peru.
Yeah, you're not kidding. Because in the chat room, Joaquin was asking, how is it possible that these cities were built, these structures were built by the Maya civilization as it was proclaimed, when they didn't even have writing. So we know that these were much, much earlier. It's just amazing to me that we were building such, I don't know, man was building such structures, and they really appeared to have their ducks in a row, per se. These are astonishing accomplishments that they were achieving, being the distances they traveled either on foot or by sea, the buildings they put up, and then there we are in the caves making Clovis points.
Right.
It's just amazing to me that such accomplishments, as mankind, we keep reaching such a high level, and then it's like we just keep starting over again.
That's for sure.
It sure repeats itself.
I mean, the ancient Romans, were very advanced in terms of their philosophy, their religion, and so on. And then, when the Germanic barbarians came in, civilization was set back in great parts of the West for 1,000 years. We went backwards, and we didn't start going forwards again until the Enlightenment begins in the 18th century. So we had a period that stretched from, say, 600 A.D. to 1800 A.D., almost 1,200 years, where it took us to get back to where Roman Greece and Egypt was 1,200 years earlier and further back. So history doesn't always progress in a straight line. You were going to ask me about the language groups in the Americas. Remember, we talked about that before the show came in.
You brought that up because I was going to mention it when I was speaking about when I was raised. Columbus came here, and there were a few American Indian tribes here. I understood that. I was taught of the ones that were in my region, and I learned about all of the other tribes that we displaced. But they were really just a dozen or 2 dozen, 3 dozen at best, I assumed, especially when it came to languages. And you were telling me that there was actually a larger variation of languages at the time.
As it turns out, linguists got into this very exciting and new field now of ancient, and it shouldn't be new, but there you are. And the linguists now, when they do studies on how a language goes into a new dialect and that new dialect becomes a new language, they have all kinds of mathematical computer language to determine, how soon a dialect breaks away from a language and becomes a dialect, and how long it takes for that dialect to become a new language. And they're looking at how long it takes particular verbs to change, irregular verbs to change, loan words to change, and so on. So they have the math of how long it takes for new languages to evolve from older languages down pat, and also from their historical records as well. Now, as it turns out, before Columbus came here, linguists can identify 500 different distinct language groups in the Americas that lived here, 500 different language groups before the arrival of Columbus. And so the linguists who looked at this using their computer models and their math in terms of how long it takes new languages to form have told us now that for 500 languages to have existed in the Americas before Columbus arrived, people would have had to have lived in the Americas at least 40,000 years. It would have been impossible for 500 languages to develop unless you had 40,000 years of time to develop those languages. And so that study, though that group of studies from linguists, set off more interest in pre-Clovis, and we're beginning now to see a correlation between the most recent findings in terms of physical archaeology showing that folks must have come over from Asia 30 to 40,000 years ago, and this linguistic proof that people had to have come over between 30 to 40,000 years ago in terms of the 500 different languages in the Americas.
Yeah, Gus, although there are many different dialects involved, and you had mentioned some, but when we were discussing it earlier, it was something like 500 languages is inventing a new language. Every 20 years, 500 languages would be 10,000 years, and it takes longer than 20 years to put a language into works, per se, if you will, to really get it caught on and to actually speak that language. It really is astonishing, because 500 languages is incredible, and it really has to have taken such a great deal of time. And it's amazing how many were lost, because I believe you even mentioned that there was 500 then, and if civilizations were still in the dwindling out period, how many were there just 200 years before that?
The language is underway, so they can identify 500 languages.
Right. That's astonishing. It's really an incredible figure. In the chat room, there was Tim C. was asking. He said, "What your thoughts were on the potential of unfound sites in Central and South America, in regards to the quantity of these sites? Do you think that there are still hundreds or thousands of these sites that we're just not even aware of yet?"
It's immense. And as a matter of fact, just from what comes to me from legitimate news sources, there's probably 10 sites a week that are being uncovered. And so just in the Amazon recently, for instance, they're finding sites because the Amazon is being denuded of forest and so on and jungle. And so sites are being uncovered that we never saw before. And we're beginning to see that the people in the jungle in the Amazon had a much more sophisticated and advanced civilization in the middle of the jungle than we ever realized before. Giant road systems, all kinds of interconnecting cities and so on, going back thousands of years in history. We didn't even know they were there. And so when I travel to Mexico, when I travel through Mexico, for example, when I'm in Oaxaca or when I'm in West Mexico, I see sites that are just being dug out by archaeologists that are not even open to the public yet, all over the place. So, I send out news of all the discoveries in the Americans on a constant basis. And there are some guys that have Peruvian news sites, and I send them the news of the sites being uncovered in South America, and they say, "No, we don't want that anymore because we'll just be inundated with it. There's so many. Tell us some other things." Because if they had to start, populating their web pages and news sites with just site discoveries, there wouldn't be room for anything else. That's how many sites there are yet to be discovered. It's exciting. Joe, are you there?
Hello, I think I lost you for a second there. Are you there?
Okay, what was the last thing I said about the sites?
Very sorry about that. It's incredible on so many things that you were saying. That number one, that there's hundreds or thousands of these sites still unknown. That we're still discovering a lot of these sites every week. We don't hear about these. We sure don't. And do you think a lot of it has to do with our shifting soils over the years, as opposed to Egypt is an excellent example where their sands pretty much have been shifting around, but for the last 5,000-6,000 years they've had the same sand sitting there. And, with our soil, it really decays things a lot quicker, but also it builds up.
In the Americas, you do this one, so I don't think that's the main key to why we're not doing this. The main key is money, research teams, the technology, the tools, the will to do this. America has got a big deficit, so the government doesn't want to spend too much money, giving out research grants to folks to do the work of finding sites in hard to live in and hard to find areas. For instance, when I was in Oaxaca on one trip, I was with an archaeologist that had excavated a major site there, a place called Lambayeco, where you have some very ornate Zapotec graves. And he pointed out to us, there was a group of us, a whole bunch of dirt mounds on the horizon that you could see all over the place. And he said each one of those is a structure. Every one of those is a structure. But we don't have the money, we don't have the teams, we don't have the manpower to go out and excavate all these places, even though you could see them. They weren't that far away. Another thing, interesting politics in Oaxaca, the people in Oaxaca do not trust the central government in Mexico. Mexico is federalized, but it's not as federalized as the United States. And there's a lot of divisions between Mexican states and Mexican regions, and there's a lot of different tribal groups in Oaxaca. And so he said one of the impediments to uncovering, the structures behind those dirt mounds that we could see is that they go over tribal boundaries. So you can't go over a tribal boundary without risking your life. So one tribe controls one area, and it's an invisible line, but they know where it is. You can't see it. There's no fence there. But if they go over into the other tribal area, guys come out with rifles and actually blow you away if you don't have permission from the Cadillo, the chieftain of the tribe, to go in there and start looking. It becomes very dangerous. And so that's politics is another impediment, especially in places like Mexico, to start excavating. If you were setting up yourself in Mexico from the United States as an archaeologist, and you just walked into some place where you saw things you could dig into with, all kinds of instruments, that's very dangerous because they don't know who you are. They suspect you're a federale that's coming to break up their land or take something from them, or they suspect that you're agents of another tribe. So you have to get all kinds of licenses, all kinds of permissions, all kinds of obstacles have to be overcome before you can start excavating day one in many of these places.
In that part of Mexico, Central America, it really seems that there are just such hidden treasures still sitting there. We speak of the things lost in that area and what was, but we really haven't uncovered much at all.
Yeah, just think in northern Peru, where this area Caral, they're finding all these sites with pyramids older than Egypt, and they're just finding them just now.
How come we're not hearing about these?
You hear about Caral, but these other sub-sites, they're a little smaller than Caral in terms of size, in terms of, population. So they're not as important to reporters or to the archaeologists themselves, for that matter, in terms of writing research papers and getting the word out. And the news of ancient America is just not widely disseminated in a lot of places. I have a huge news source, as you know, from seeing my web pages. It gets the word out, but how many people read, my reports? And so, you're not going to find these kind of reports on cable news. You're not going to find these kind of reports in Time Magazine or Newsweek or the New York Times unless it's a spectacular discovery.
Right.
So it's just a question of what we cover.
Yeah, I wonder how many of these pyramid structures really do exist down there in that area, even where you were mentioning in the Oaxaca area, because as we had spoke earlier today, the Oaxaca area, it's such a key position geographically. If you're on land, if you're on foot, you're crossing through that region, or even if you're traveling by sea and you're going to cross land. I mean, it's not ideally Panama where you want to carry your canoe, but if I was a seafaring person, it makes Central America ideal for so many ways, not even just climate. But it seems that civilization has existed there for years and years and years. And we have a call coming in here from Mr. Painter. Mr. Painter, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Painter, thank you for joining us tonight.
I'll tell you what, you got one heck of a show going here. I'm really enjoying it. And I'd like to ask the professor if he knows it. I know Brian Forrester, who is the director of the museum in Paracas, Peru, and he's doing an in-depth study on the elongated skulls down there. Do you think it's possible that they could have been connected with the Clovis people?
Cranial deformation, as it turns out, and it's because this information is so splotchily disseminated and in such widely disparate areas that people don't put this together. But cranial deformation in the ancient Americas goes all the way back to the earliest settlers from Asia into Siberia. There's cranially deformed skulls that are found way up in Alaska that would have been cranially deformed by the folks who lived there shortly after they came from Asia. So the Paracas skulls, the skulls in the cranially deformed skulls that you find all across South America, all across Mesoamerica, all across North America, as a matter of fact, and all the way up to Alaska, that's not a new phenomenon. So yes, they're all connected because it was a widespread phenomena, and it was a widespread phenomena from the earliest times all the way up to the end of ancient American civilizations. So the Paracas skulls are just one of thousands of cultures that created these cranially deformed skulls. The Olmecs created cranially deformed skulls. The Maya created cranially deformed skulls.
The ones he's been studying are not cradle boarding. These are natural elongated skulls. They are not cradle boarded.
Well, there's some disagreement about exactly how those skulls were formed. It would be very, very difficult to believe that those were natural skulls. In my belief, it's a form of cranial deformation of some kind. You find skulls exactly like this that look like the Paracas skulls in Baja. You wouldn't recognize the difference between the Paracas skulls and the Baja skulls in terms of the shape of the head, the shape of the skull. And those were by way of cranial deformation.
Well, thank you for your answer. I appreciate it. Great show, Joe. Keep
Hey,
going.
thank you, Mr. Painter.
Thanks a lot.
It's been such a hot debated topic about the elongated skulls, and I really don't even know enough about it. I sure know enough about what people are saying. However, I know there were certain manipulations done, but I'd like to know a lot more about it, I guess, before I even talk on it.
It was a craft, as I told you. The craft of cranial deformation goes back to the earliest first Americans. All the way up to the Arctic region, they were cranially deforming folks. So, by the time the Paracas culture comes along, there would have been folks who were pretty proficient at doing this kind of thing, just like with the Clovis blade, in very artistic style. The Olmecs made cranially deformed people that looked like cone heads, round, sort of pyramid-shaped skulls that were done by way of artificial cranial deformation of young babies from the time they're born, shaping the skull in that style.
I have to get back to these very early civilizations that you're saying possibly 20, 30,000 years ago, where we're seeing signs of it in South America. This is a very early time we're talking about, and we're really not supposed to have been doing much at that time. Where there's at least, again, if you don't mind me saying, what I was taught in school was 30,000 years ago. We really weren't doing much. We really didn't even have a point in arrow. We weren't doing any of that yet. And now we're discussing seafaring, very long migrations, civilizations, religion,
ideas, exactly,
artistic flourishments, and obviously a know-how of the stars, clearly with navigation. especially with the Polynesians. I don't even know how they got to where they did with the vessels they had, but
And back again.
yeah, they were really good at it. Apparently, they were very, very good at it. I don't know if they just mastered the currents and the winds and the reading of it, but because with seafaring, it's so hard when you make a mistake out at sea in those times, you're dead. You're gone. The sea's swallowing you up. It's very hard to come back and say what you had done wrong. So you really don't get to learn on the trial and error part when crossing the sea several thousands of years ago. It must have been tough. It must have been important reasons. I can't even imagine the necessities. Was it for luxury? Was trade? What was trade for? It had to have been for trade.
Trade, and I think just the adventurous nature of human beings over the horizon. We're an inquisitive species, so that also had to be driving them. And they're coming from small islands, so it may be that they always had to be on the lookout for new islands where the food resources hadn't been hunted out or ecologically damaged in some way. So that may have driven them forward. But then to go all the way from as far away as Hawaii in terms of Polynesian islands to get to Easter Island, that's more than just looking for food. That's adventure travel, I think.
That's definitely adventure traveler, because even if you're off 1 degree from the distance they're traveling, you're going to miss by hundreds of miles.
Exactly.
And that's a terrible, terrible thing to do. Is you're really in the middle of nowhere. It must have. They really must have had purpose, and I mean, adventure to 1 degree.
And that's why you have to believe in this Polynesian south of sun, that had to have existed. The skills of the Polynesian source.
Well, I could see a bit of the Polynesian resemblance in the Olmec stoneheads as well. I know Asian, yes, but it's possible a few of those faces. They're interesting faces, you have to admit, the stones.
What's interesting about the Olmec art is almost all of it is related back to the jaguar and their origin story, which is an interesting story concerning what they call the were jaguar. And so there's jaguar elements in almost every piece of art. Jaguar noses, jaguar mouths, feline elements in the faces and so on, because the jaguar was their most important god. It was the most powerful god they had. It's one they worshipped with the most reverence. And they believed in a story about a virgin birth that a jaguar god mixed with a human female and gave birth to the Olmec race, which is half jaguar, half human. So we have these stories of gods mixing with virgin females throughout all religions in human history, and the Olmecs have that story too. The god mixes with the female, human, and gives forth this race, this supernatural race, half jaguar and half human. So that's why you see the noses of on the Olmec heads are very squat, flat, and so are feline noses. The mouths are downturned, like feline mouths. You have a little what they call a V-shaped cleft at the top of a lot of these heads. If you feel on top of a feline's head, big tiger's heads, they have a little cleft in the middle of their head under their fur if you were to put your head up there. And so it's all related to the jaguar. And then when we look at the jaguar and we look at these jaguar stories, you can relate it back to jaguar myths among the ancient Chinese people. There's a relationship there over time and space, I think, in terms of this jaguar imagery.
Okay. Yeah, that would make sense. I'm looking at a few of these pictures here. I see exactly what you're saying in description of the jaguar resemblance, the personification of it. Yeah, these are pretty...
A lot of them are wearing ball players' helmets. They are ball players' helmets because if you wanted to show yourself as a hero, if they wanted to show somebody sculpted as a hero, they would often show them wearing a ball player's helmet, because the ball game that they played in the ancient Americas was a sport only aristocrats and highborn people could play, and it was a life and death game. Human sacrifice was involved in this game, so you had to be very courageous. So these giant heads that you're looking at with jaguar elements in it, we think are probably the heads of important rulers at that site that had played the ball game. It was heroic to go around wearing that ball helmet made out of leather because it showed that you played the ball game. And they're almost like Babe Ruth in terms of the, as you see, the physiognomy, big, heroic, magnified, courageous face. And so these were magnified, courageous faces of rulers, and one of the aspects of rulership was to have played that ball game and to have worn that ball player's helmet. So that's part of those heads as well, the iconography of those heads.
Yeah, that's amazing. And
Well,
they really held these to very high importance, I'm sure. Especially, you told me the story how far they hauled these things.
Right.
I know it's very delicate to haul them. Never mind when they're already carved. It's got to be very gingerly processed.
From the iconography on the heads, they have very big lips, a lot of them. And what did that come from? Well, if you go to the Maya region today and you look at some of the Native American inhabitants, they have those same big lips and those same flatter noses that you see that are portrayed in the Olmec heads. It's them, except made more heroic because they're making strong rulers. So, it should be no surprise that they look like that in the statues because the indigenous people in the Gulf Coast region have flatter noses and bigger lips. So they're also portraying who they are as well.
Right. I completely see. I never understood what they had on the head, but the helmets make sense. But I know in Central America, their ball games have included sacrifices through many civilizations. It seems like a lot of our ancient civilizations, we really can't get too far away from sacrifices. It sure seems to be present, I could tell you that. But the creation story you were just telling me too about the jaguar. I do remember hearing something about that related to the early days in China. But it's quite interesting how many civilizations have a creation story that the particular animal, their half animal. It's very interesting that's when we're speaking about the Olmecs, for instance, it's very interesting that they have a creation story that they somehow were created from a jaguar into an animal, as opposed to saying, we come from a foreign land and we've come here 2,000 years ago. It's very interesting that it always goes back to something like that, as opposed to we always lose track on the human trail,
Right.
Our timeline.
That's one of the problems with discussing this with Native Americans is that they also have a dogma in almost all Native American societies across the country that they were always here. They don't want to hear that they came from someplace else. So they insist that they evolved in America. So nobody else could have been them. And so that's a common feature among cultures, to not want to believe that someone else created you, that you were genetically preceded by others.
Yeah, that was part of the argument with Kennewick Man too, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And that was quite an argument because...
Hello?
Are
Are you still there, Professor?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you just fine. I think I just lost you for just a few seconds there.
The Native Americans in the region there in Washington State wanted to bury Kennewick Man as fast as they could because they heard this Caucasoid skull story, and they certainly didn't want to believe that the white guys got there before they did. So that's why they wanted to bury it. That was the controversy. When it was explained to them that the Caucasoid skull is Asiatic and it's not European, they still weren't willing to give up on the idea that they should, seize the skeleton and bury it, simply because they didn't want to believe that they were preceded as peoples by others who came from further afield. They don't want to know that, they don't want to hear about it, and they don't want to believe it.
Well, that sounds pretty definitive.
Yes. That's why they have to keep it under lock and key, the whole skeleton.
Now, Kennewick Man, he was correct me if I'm wrong, he was found in an apple orchard? Am I getting this wrong?
Well, it was like in a bog-like area, though. So the bones were some kind of soil that the bones were preserved in. Otherwise, it would have been long disintegrated. So we were lucky where they found it. It was found near sort of a boggy soil that would preserve bones and wouldn't eat into the bones.
Yeah.
And it was on federal land. And that became another controversy because you got that Native American Repatriation Act, which is a federal law. And when the Native American tribes came to the federal government, during the Clinton era this was, to demand that this skeleton be turned over to the tribe, the Clinton administration decided that they had to follow the federal law and turn that body over to the Native American tribes. And then several large archaeological groups got an injunction from the courts and delayed turning over the body to the Native Americans and it went through the courts for years and years and years. And finally, in the final decision in the federal appellate court, years after the body was found, the judge there asked the physical anthropologist and archaeologist to explain to him in as simple a scientific term as they could why this Kennewick Man was not related to this tribe that was demanding that the skeleton be turned over. And they proved to him with enough definitive wording so that he said, okay, Kennewick Man is not this tribe. He's from somewhere else. His ancestors are from somewhere else. And so the researchers can keep the skeleton. They don't have to turn the skeleton over to that tribe. So that was a landmark decision in terms of learning more about the first Americans, that federal appellate court judge did not order the skeleton to be turned over to the tribe.
Yeah. Nothing that really goes in their favor. But, with Kennewick Man, I'm really shocked that we haven't figured out, given this guy a final resting place, per se, why we haven't gone through a full analysis, to do something with it. Why is it just sitting around?
The last article I read as to why they have not been able to do a follow-up or definitive final study of Kennewick Man is the chief researcher said, I just don't have the time. Apparently, to embark on something like this might take, you would have to do this as your full-time job for the next couple of years. And they're all involved in other projects, and there's just not anybody there that's willing to take this task on of doing further studies. It's frustrating, and I keep looking for reports that they've done a further study, and I would be able to find out, and they have not. And it's been years sitting in that lab.
Yeah, sometimes I don't think of it that way. I think of it as it's an easy test, as you just send it through a machine and we wait for the printout of the answers.
It's not quite that easy.
Right. I often forget it does take a team or two and lengthy research and exhausting efforts.
But at least we know the multicultural, multiracial aspect. And so
Very
that
true.
opened up a whole new avenue of who the first Americans were. That was important.
And that in one way or another, someone stuck him with a point. He had something in him.
Yes, exactly.
So he was in a bad situation in one degree or another.
Right. Obviously, this would have been a sparsely populated land with probably all kinds of conflicts going on between nomadic tribes. And he got hit.
Yeah. And he picked a good spot.
And if they find another skeleton nearby that's like him, they're going to have to go through the same court struggle again. And because the tribe's going to say, well, that's not Kennewick Man, it's another skeleton. We want it under the federal law.
So does that bring you to a point when you find a really good site and you're working through it? Are you almost hoping not to find a skeleton?
That's what archaeologists are saying. As a matter of fact, sometimes they're not going to tell you they found a skeleton because all work will stop.
Right.
I was talking to a researcher at Cahokia a couple months ago, and he alluded to this fact that you better not find a body, because immediately the research will be ended. So they may find something like bones, and they just simply won't report it because they've got to get on with their work.
Now, it seems that a few Clovis sites that I've read on have been on either state land or federal land. I'm sure there's some sort of coincidence involved in this, but how is it, where in Kennewick Man's case, how was it that we came across him in this former bog on federal land?
It was uncovered during rainstorms, because there's a lot of rain there, of course, and people saw bones, and they sent archaeologists actually to investigate it, luckily, and that's how it was dug up. I mean, it was just eroded, the earth over it got eroded away, and the bones were seen coming out of the earth. So it was an accident.
Just like it's like a woolly mammoth coming out of the permafrost.
Right. And I think some of these Clovis sites date before the NAGPRA law was introduced. And so whatever work they did before, they don't have to bury it. But if they find bones now in some of these sites in Clovis areas, like the Topper site, they still have to deal with this controversial law. And perhaps at the Topper site, the Native American tribes in the region may have given their blessing. I mean, in some places, you know, there's a Native American council that has enough legitimacy in the eyes of the state government to where they can make a decision one way or the other, and maybe some of these Native American councils in areas like the Topper site have told them to go ahead and investigate. So you have that too. There are some Native American councils that don't mind having their ancestors being investigated, but most of them don't like it.
Yeah, I understand that completely, and I don't know how the tribes are in the Topper site area. I know where I am in the sites that we had mentioned that there was a possibility of Clovis activity elsewhere here in the state of South Carolina. I know the Native American tribe that holds that region, they've been battling with the federal courts for years because they're not federally recognized. They don't get the same treatment and the same laws as a lot of the other tribes in the nation get. However, I don't know if they are the only tribe ruling over that justification or jurisdiction of that area. But that Topper site here in South Carolina, that seems to be a pretty big spot. It seems like there's a lot of work going on there.
Huge teams, season after season, year after year, and they have dug down very deep, and the chief archaeologist there is claiming that, you know, he's got evidence of people living there 40,000 years ago.
Wow.
Now, the problem with this kind of claim is it's pretty extreme. And if you're going to say you have proof that people lived there 40,000 years ago, you better come up with some pretty specific and wide-ranging and legitimate evidence to back that claim up. And while some archaeologists who have gone to the site and looked at his 40,000-year-old artifacts, he says, agree that this is probably true, most archaeologists in the community now would not agree to that. He doesn't have any. Are you there?
Yep. All right, Professor, that's the end of the show. We're going to have you back to talk a little more.